Now, I'm going to give our panelists a minute to introduce themselves. Then we can get into the real meat of this discussion. I start with Tulu from Nigeria.
Good morning. My name is Tolu Ogunlesi from Nigeria. I work as a special assistant to the President of Nigeria on digital and new media, which means that I oversee digital communications for the government of Nigeria. Before then, I advised the Minister of Trade and Investment also on communications. But for a long time before then, I worked as a journalist. So I kind of consider myself more than anything else a journalist. And well, I think the other thing to add is that in 2016, I set up the Presidency Office of Digital Engagement in Nigeria as sort of a first step towards finding ways to adapt government communications to the new age.
Second is we discovered that we are not compliant. Then we have introduced our young sister from Botswana, Gogon Tanjang. If you can introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to add almost gender balance to this panel. My name is Gogon Tanjang Paladi, and I'm from Botswana. Professionally, I'm a development practitioner. I work in human and social development, but I also have extensive experience working in communications. And I run a tech company that is youth-owned and led by young people that works on innovations. But the kind of innovations that we work on or invest in, that those that about transforming people's lives, particularly looking at human and social development aspects.
Next to me is Mr. Machogu. If you could take a minute.
My name is Tirimba Machogu. I currently serve as the Legal and Policy Advisor to the Cabinet Secretary at the Ministry of Education. And before that, I was a lecturer at the University of Nairobi School of Law, where I taught for over 10 years in areas such as law science and technology, commercial law, international law, among others.
Mr. Mandla from South Africa, if you could.
Thanks, Session Chair. Good morning, colleagues, all protocol observed. My name is Mandla Ngobo. I'm currently serving as the Government Chief Information Officer for the Public Service in South Africa. My role currently is around ensuring that we move public services to various online platforms. Before that, I've had an opportunity of working in the private sector, telecommunications sector in particular, where we looked at rolling out various kind of products, commercial and non-commercial. So besides that, we also have good experience in the ICT policy and regulation, particularly previous what we used to refer to as broadcasting and telecommunications before the convention environment.
Morning, everybody. I'm Cedric from Ivory Coast. I'm currently the head of the new media department of the High Authority for Governance, which is our national anti-corruption agency. Before that, I was working with NDI on election observation, ruling a so-called pilot vote tabulation. And before that, I was working to the Prime Minister Cabinet as a new media assistant. I'm currently based in London because I go back to study, so I'm doing an MA in Governance and Corruption at the University of Sussex. And I'm really focused on using digital media and technology for transparency and anti-corruption fields.
I hope you noted that some of their titles, they were not in public service about 5 years ago. And this is the trend that we are going to see going forward, that in the next 10 years, probably, the titles they will be having are completely different from what we have today. So I want to give Tulu a few minutes to tell us about how they manage social media or fake media, which has become a big problem in this fourth industrial revolution.
Thank you. I don't know how many people here are aware of what I would call one of the biggest pieces of fake news to have come out of any part of the world, which came out, I think, last year, which was that the Nigerian president had died and had been cloned and that the man that we saw was a body double or a clone from the Sudan. I don't know how much of that sort of went outside of Nigeria. Actually, it was on, I think, the BBC. It got quite international coverage, actually. And so for me, that was a very striking moment, sort of in this evolution of fake news, where people came to legitimately believe, and find supporting evidence for the fact that a head of state had died and was cloned. But it also made me think a lot about sort of, as I said, how fake news has evolved. And it occurred to me that, look, there's nothing new I think a starting point is that there's nothing new about fake news. It's always been with human beings, and it says a lot about sort of technology and human behavior. That none of the technologies mentioned, for example, in the presentation, the human behaviors behind them are not new in any way. So think about sort of listening to music. Humans have listened to music for as long as humans have probably existed. At one point, of course, it would have been people dancing around the campfire, singing, listening to themselves. Then it gets to radio, to television. Then it gets into a Walkman, the Sony Walkman, which is now defunct. And then it jumps 20 years later or 30 into the iPod, which again doesn't, I don't think anybody uses an iPod anymore. And now all the music we have is on our phones. So the human behaviors are consistent. So fake news as well, there's nothing new. I say this because people tend to sort of somewhat suggest that fake news came with social media. We know that that's not true. So what technology then does is that it takes that basic element and then amplifies it. So we had doctored videos of Photoshop. And so it was quite, for somebody who was inclined to believe along those lines, it was easy to believe. And that takes me to another point about technology, which is that the cost and access to technology in the fourth industrial revolution has fallen significantly. So the computers of the 1960s that cost tens of thousands of dollars and will fill up somewhere as big as this, that computing power now can be found in our phones. What it means now is that Photoshop, which was once, which could only be done in the past by experts, today with an app or two on your phone, you can do Photoshop. You can edit a video. So it's a big challenge and not just for governments in the emerging economies or developing world, but anywhere in the world. In the US, we've seen it happen. The most advanced democracy in the world. In the UK, we've seen the fake news at the heart of Brexit. We've seen it at the heart of the US elections in 2016, and it's going to happen again in 2020. We've seen it in India. We've seen with WhatsApp. I don't think there's anybody here who doesn't use WhatsApp. So the challenge is that there are no easy answers. And so for someone like me who's worked in government for a few years, it's a constant battle. I think the only sure thing we can say now is that governments are almost always one step or two steps behind behind technology. Governments are, and I'm not sure that was always the case. Once upon a time, governments used to be ahead in the sense that it was so easy to shut down a radio station or a TV station, or ban a newspaper, those kind of things, or to contain what you thought were threats. Now, in 2019, it's impossible. Government is almost always a step behind, and so that's going to be one of the defining things about the fourth industrial revolution, that governments will always, as soon as you think you've dealt with the issue of Photoshop or whatever it is, the technology has advanced.
Thank you so much. Mr. Machogu, we have heard about fake news. We are trying to get educational content online. What are the ministries of education doing to regulate such content?
Concerns that we've had at the Ministry of Education is responding to what are we training for And that, I think, fits right into the conversation that we're having this morning, because the moment we ask what we are training for, then that means that we arrive at a response that requires us to deliver demand-driven training. And that demand-driven training has to be learning that is contextual. And the context for the conversation this morning is the fourth industrial revolution. And that really is one of the several facets that has been roped into our conversations on the question, what are we training for? And in that respect, what we have been looking at, and this is even before we get into regulation, is we are looking at a context that requires us to pay attention to government policy at the national level, and for Kenya, we're also looking at government policy at the county level, because counties are empowered under our constitution to come up with their own development plans. And in looking at that, we are also engaging with government to ensure that their policy is aligned and attuned to the demands of the present, just as we look at demands for the future. We're also looking at trends in the private sector, because we have to look at what I think in the keynote was referred to as the future of work. So when we talk about work, both in the public and the private sector, then we have to be cognizant of some of the demands of the present, just as we look at demands of upcoming demands of the future. What are the opportunities that are likely to be created? What are the opportunities that are likely to be lost? And how do we then cater for that? And then ultimately, we are also looking at global and regional trends, where we would want to know within the, from a Kenyan perspective, for example, within the East African region, what are some of the growing trends? And from an African perspective, what are the growing trends? And then internationally, what are the trends and how does our education system fit into that? And in that respect, part of the initiatives that we are currently undertaking includes at the basic level of education a curriculum that is competency-based, where we are moving from rote memorization and simple literacy to encouraging our students to learn how to code at ages as early as 8 to 10 years old, rather than introducing them to tech for their first time, either in high school or at the university level of education. And that is something that we are anticipating will be relevant skills when we think about the future of work. We are also looking at reskilling our teachers so that they have the relevant skills for them to be able to undertake this competency-based training, and we are looking at the relevant infrastructural upgrades. That is also happening at the technical and vocational level of education, and at the university level of education, we are looking at how to empower them so that they can become research and innovative hubs in order for them to be able to carry the agenda of education for the fourth industrial revolution. More specifically on the question of regulation, we have begun a process of reforms of all the education laws from the education level, from the basic education level right through to the tertiary level. And one of the key things that we are looking at is how do we empower our institutions and programs so that they can be relevant within the context of the fourth industrial revolution. And in undertaking that, those tools of regulation, we are alive to several factors. The key of them being that it is almost impossible for law to always be up to date with the transformative, innovative ideas, particularly within the technological and other spaces. And therefore, we need to come up with an approach that provides the flexibility and the latitude for people to innovate. And that is the best atmosphere around which innovation can take place. And therefore, we are looking at barriers within our education system that would prevent such innovation and trying to come up with innovative regulatory reforms that will give that latitude and flexibility within which such innovation can occur.
I don't know how wide you can speak on this, because Philip talked about that to be ready, you've got to invest in infrastructure. You've got to invest in internet, invest in electricity, and all this. Can you talk to us about South Africa? And because I know we used to work regionally through NEPAD, if you can also mention a few things about that.
Maybe not so much, for instance, at the NEPAD level, purely because I know that there is a program called PIDA that looks at developing infrastructure at various levels, ICT, energy, transportation, and so on, within the African continent, with the view of ensuring that, there is connectivity amongst the African countries so that we improve socio-economic conditions in those countries. But number two, Prof, the issue of infrastructure is very key. I mean, when the countries that are in the forefront of the 4IR, like Germany, when they talk about Industry 4.0, one of the least issues that they are concerned about is connectivity. So for developing world, particularly African countries, we cannot overemphasize the need for that. But if one were to come straight to my environment, South Africa, I can tell you that some of the challenges that we are facing in the country is in and around regulation, particularly towards the run towards 2010. Numerous companies were digging roads to kind of put in fiber on the ground. Why? Simply because there had been an unbundling of competition. So all of a sudden, companies were allowed to self-provide. So initially, we had telecom only. That was the wholesale provider of connectivity. So service providers were then expected to go to telecom, and only to find that that was stifling some competition because the conditions under which they would be required to connect to telecom infrastructure was very anti-competitive. In actual fact, even the time delays, the telecom would deliberately do that. But the interesting thing is that at the stage when the market was opened, yes, there was a marginal increase in terms of connectivity, but again, owing to anti-competitive behavior of service providers, South Africa is one of the countries that have got a whole lot of unlit fiber. So there's serious dark fiber on the ground, but it's not utilized, in particular maximally utilized. Now, what does it mean? It means that as much as infrastructure is important and facilitate connectivity and ensure that you've got various kind of abilities and capabilities to play on that, it becomes important that regulation or ICT sector in general is regulated appropriately. One of the opportunities that we're also looking at, which because of regulations, also because of the, I would say, political interface, is the issue around digital migration, broadcast digital migration. It's an opportunity that is going to allow the country to provide various kinds of services, including via platforms like television. So where you are at your home, you're able to transact with government. However, purely because of the alignment politically, where do you want to be seen to be going, which standard are you going to comply with? We have missed the boat. It was due in, I think the migration was due in 2015, the very first. So in summary or conclusion, I want to say, yes, infrastructure is important. However, it becomes important that we have some level of competition, right? Why? Simply because service providers tend to lead to the infrastructure rollout.
Shedrick, Philip talked about Africans being citizens of countries in Europe, sending money without even government noting. What do you think technology will do to help in terms of governance in the days to come?
Yeah, I think governance is really a wide topic. So I will rather focus on corruption, as corruption is, I think, the main issue that developing countries are facing. And I'm trying actually to provide a definition saying that corruption is the abuse of untrusted power for private gain. And by this, I will just start with an equation saying that corruption equals to monopoly plus discretion minus accountability. So if actually we're going to talk about integration of ICT into kind of reform to lower the monopoly and the discretion or increase the accountability, I will, for instance, talking about the monopoly, talking about one-stop shop centers. The one-stop shop centers was not only applied in Kenya, actually it started in Singapore and then was emulated in India, and then we have this kind of appliance nearly everywhere. And if you're talking about lowering the discretion, you will actually talk about having access to information to make sure that the public servant doesn't have that much power to threaten or to kind of have a kind of extortion to customers. So by then we can actually talking about apps to provide access to information about administrative procedures and also related to the prices of the services and goods. If you're going to talk about increasing the accountability, you will go through open governance data. You will also talk about clear public contracting procedure. You will talk about public budget spending, and you will make open public servant salaries and the asset declaration. But as we can see, there is, for me, a kind of challenge, and the challenge is related to try to discover whether the government is behind intentionally or not. So for me, it's more related to political interference in digital tech-based reform shaping. What I mean is there is evidence saying that there is an absence of culture of performance into the public service or administration where the government are unstable. There is also a conflict of interest between political party financing through informal rent-seeking in public service delivery and cutting corruption in public service delivery. So then if you're going to actually implement a technology that will cut those rents, you will definitely be faced a resistance through the political sector. And yeah, last but not least, you will talk about the culture of informality. Most of our economy in Africa are much than 70% informal. And for instance, in Cote d'Ivoire, there is 70% of our production of cocoa, which is sold through informal chain. And it's also the same actually in Ethiopia, where the production of coffee is sold through informal ways, at least at a rate of 70% level. So how can we actually tackle these kind of issues? Is by having standards, because there is also ICT for transparency and anti-corruption standards. For instance, if you're talking about a one-stop center, the one-stop center should be designated to the most demanding services, so then they can reach a higher impact. And this kind of center should be ruled by the government, public servants. So there is like kind of, you should not give the contract to operate those centers to the private sector. You should train your people, the public servant, to operate and to manage those centers. And at the end, the center should try to tackle the red flags. That means the points or the step where there is a high risk of corruption. And then there is other kind of standards. Actually, if you're talking about open contracting principle or open data principle, so there is definitely regulation and standards, but it's more that maybe the political aspect is more reluctant to not apply those standards by designing anti-corruption and ICT reforms. Going to that, we're going to the fourth revolution. And through the fourth revolution, if you're talking about lowering, for instance, the discretion, you will having kind of artificial intelligence features that will allow the citizens to not only having access to information through mobile, but having automating and translating voice interaction between a server. So that means if an illiterate consumer asks a request to the app, that app could easily talk in Kiswahili or whatever in local language, so that the illiterate consumer could have access to information, even if that consumer is not a literate consumer. So talking about some another application into anti-corruption and governance fields, we can also talk about the use of blockchain. For instance, if you're talking about cutting this informality or this informal sector into the economy, we can talk about using blockchain in Kenya to try to solve the problem of land ownership. We can also talk about the use of blockchain in Tunisia to try to deliver diploma and degree certification that could be entrusted. If you're talking about the use of blockchain in Ethiopia, we can relate to that, try to make a kind of entrusted supply chain into the cocoa and the coffee sector. So for me, there is two key recommendations, because I think that the fourth industrial revolution is not only a way to predict our future, it's a call for action. By then, I can say that technology is too important to be only ruled by tech or techie hands. By then, I'm saying that the first thing is our studies or our education, like our engineering or IT curriculum, should be not only related to engineering, but also be related to a kind of cross-disciplinary approaches. So try to integrate social sciences and human sciences. And by then, I can advocate to increase the research budgets to this thematic by also try to integrate our cultural approaches. And the second and the last recommendation I would like to advocate for is that technology should not be left behind into the political agenda. And at the national level, I am talking about technology must be a basic and social needs or services such as education, water, electricity, and food, or security, health and safety, because you can have technology in all those sectors. So technology is that important and so important that you cannot left it into the second agenda at the national level. And at the international level, we should be sure that African countries have a common ground and a common platform to express themselves so that their voice could be heard in trying to integrating and formulating reform and regulations in this fourth revolution and the sovereignty of countries. And yeah, you can actually see that in the news, is that the launch of the last cryptocurrency called Libra by Facebook and supported by the key major tech industries in the world is definitely trying to strengthen our sovereignty as states and into the world. So it's more like technology is not a game. Definitely, we should take it seriously.
Now, Paladi, we've heard from Shedrick talking about use cases of technology. Could you say a little bit how the new technologies that would run the fourth industrial revolution are used in, say, healthcare?
Very insightful and I think important points have been raised by fellow panelists. So earlier on when I was introducing myself, I mentioned that I work in human and social development, and most of my life I've worked in sexual reproductive health and rights. Some people or many people may know that my country, Botswana, once had the dubious distinction of having the highest HIV and AIDS prevalence in the whole world. It's still high, but we're no longer the highest. And while I was doing that, because I have an NGO that has been working on human rights for many years, we were doing outreaches in different communities, civic education, and helping them access healthcare services and all of those things. So while we were doing several of our outreaches, we found that a lot of people who were infected with HIV were actually defaulting, and they ended up having AIDS. And then we'd ask them, why is it that you are defaulting? And they'll simply say they forgot to go for the refill, they forgot to go and check the CD4 count or viral load and all of those things. And I sat back and I reflected, and I said, in Botswana, if you are stopped by the police and you are charged, the Department of Transport will make sure they send you SMS reminders that you actually have a traffic fine. They also send reminders that you have to go and renew your vehicle registration. And I asked myself, why is it that we cannot remind a person who's living with a chronic illness to go and refill the medication, the doctor's appointment, blood tests, all of those things, as well as even informing them using GPS location where the nearest health post could be. And this is the first thing that we worked on with my team and said, we're going to develop this. It's going to be a USSD-based platform, so you don't have to necessarily have a smartphone to use it, but to send constant reminders to people who have cancer, HIV, expectant mothers, on how they can take care of themselves, and just those healthcare reminders and flash messaging. And that's one of the ways that, for me, I see a lot of potential for technology to accelerate our human and social development indicators in Africa, and to enable us to actually do a lot more, especially in the healthcare system, because we know that many countries are doing very poorly in Africa when it comes to healthcare. This is in terms of access to services, access to commodities, and all of those things. So there's a lot that technology can really help in the healthcare sector. Right now, there are countries that have a huge problem with data deficits, for example. The leading cause of death among young women in Africa is backstreet abortions, but we don't have comprehensive data on those abortions, on teenage pregnancy, all of those things. And the data that is available is not even disaggregated. When you look at healthcare data, usually they don't have any data on adolescents. They go to children, which is under 5, and then after that it goes to the much older ones. So it can actually help a lot in terms of having accurate, reliable data, and even dissemination. Sometimes in Botswana, surveys are done and all of those things, and then they just sit on the shelves, because the only way they disseminate that information is when they go physically to the districts and then they drop that off. So I think we have a potential to use it for data for data collection and dissemination. I think it can also help in terms of healthcare commodity management systems. And this is something that even in Botswana we struggle with, where you find commodities expire in certain healthcare posts, whereas there are others that actually have those commodities in excess, simply because we don't have a database or portals that report in real time the commodities that are existent in each healthcare post across the country. So I think it can help a lot in terms of having real-time healthcare commodity management system. I think also even in terms of diagnosis, in terms of reaching out to people in rural areas, in terms of access to information like counseling. I think Philip was talking about a platform that is being used where that people are able to get counseling services virtually without needing to go to a counselor or physically in a clinic or book well in advance to do that. Artificial intelligence can produce a medical diagnosis from an X-ray much faster than a radiologist can, and it would actually have much more accuracy than than when you use the way it has been used traditionally. So I think there's a lot that we can learn in that, and just cross-sector. One of the developers that I worked with a few years ago developed an offline tracking system, because Botswana is also a cattle-rich country. A lot of people tend to joke that the cow population is more than our national population, which is actually true. So beef is very big in Botswana, but a lot of farmers lose that opportunity because of stock theft, because of so many things. So this young person developed an offline tracking chip for cows. And the reason why it works offline is because in rural areas you wouldn't get strong connectivity that is reliable. But a farmer can be able to track the cow's movement to see where it is, even if it has been taken by the police because it was on the road or anything of that sort. They're able to fully track it. And even in terms of registration, when the authorities pick up stray cattle. They're able to identify it against the database that is, and all because it is digitized. So I think there is a lot of potential across our sectors that can accelerate our development indicators and indeed harnessing the demographic dividend, as is the theme for this. Now, I just wanted to say very quickly in the end that I think there are certain things that are very important to take very seriously. The first thing, I like the slide from Philip where he said the most important investments that can be made towards the fourth industrial revolution are in data, internet, and electricity. Botswana is one of the most developed countries in Africa. It's actually an upper middle income country. It has a very high GDP, and we have only 2 million people, but we still cannot give consistent electricity supply to just 2 million people across the whole country. We can have great innovations, operating systems, software, all of those things, but if you cannot give people electricity, then it is just an exercise in futility. The other thing that I think is very important is regulations, because I think many governments have just trusted the service providers to be the ones to they charge us for the services that they offer. But government needs to have very strong hold in regulating the service providers. So I think the government needs to put regulatory measures to ensure that these service providers do not extort us. And maybe when it comes to other innovations, especially that deal with like education, health, see how service providers can give subsidized user fees as a way of them contributing to corporate social responsibility. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that we also need to look at it from a very multi-sectoral approach. I think one of the speakers here was saying that, digital transformation, we shouldn't just think technology and then that's it and leave it to the tech side, but to look at it from all sectors. What does it mean for education? What does it mean for agriculture? What does it mean for immigration? What does it mean for land management and use? And when we do that, we see it as a holistic approach. It's not just about transport or communications, but it's about transformation from all different sectors, and have a very unified approach to how do we invest in this. One of the biggest pluses about digitization is that it reduces our carbon footprint, and that is the truth. We need to really accelerate our commitment to climate actions. We cannot still be having so many printouts being done, yet we are saying, it's very funny. You see governments that are saying we've moved towards e-government, and they probably print more papers than even the newspapers themselves, So we need to look at even the climate benefits of that. There's a lot that can happen here, but we need to really know that the first basis is the infrastructural development that needs to happen. Let's not jump to let's have applications. Let us give people electricity. Let us have reliable internet. Let us have stable connectivity. Let us have affordable data. Then we can talk about all of these nice softwares and all of those things. And the very last point, governments need to commit to invest in homegrown innovations. That is the truth. I think somebody was saying that when you go to all of these Silicon Valleys and all of that, you find that a lot of the best engineers are actually Africans, and you ask yourself, why is it that Tolu, with his brilliance, the government of Nigeria could not embrace him so that he can contribute or add value to his country, but a company in London actually tapped on that opportunity. So let us invest in homegrown innovations. When we want to do an innovation or platform and then there's a bid out, even if a foreign company wins that tender, let us make sure they come, they work in Africa, they assemble in Africa, they hire Africans so that we build our capacity. Government buys phones and laptops for mostly senior managerial position people. They buy them phones and laptops. Let us have affirmative actions where governments will deliberately say we are no longer using Samsung or Apple. We are going to procure from a local company that has developed these gadgets. So I think it's just those very simple and practical things that we can do.
I would briefly ask 2-3 questions, then we come back to the audience to ask questions. I will start with Cedric again to talk briefly on because he's been talking about governance. We lose almost $1 trillion from Africa to be hidden outside there. And you talked about cryptocurrency or a global currency. What do you think our government should do so that we don't find that from next year we are losing 2 trillion and then we are given 30 billion as aid? So what are we going to do?
Thank you, Mr. I think cryptocurrency is not a bad thing. Definitely is, if you're going to have $1, you need to convert it in Kiswahili, right? But if you're in the hotel, they will give you a rate of 95. If you're in the Forex office, they will probably give you a rate of 102, or if you're the airport, they will give a rate of 90. But with cryptocurrency, is that there is no intermediaries. So 1 Bitcoin in Kenya equals to 1 Bitcoin in the US or in the UK. So you will not have that fear when you're going actually to transfer money at an individual level, or if you were government. Discussion has already started here in Kenya, trying to use mobile money or M-Pesa to convert in Bitcoins. And I think there is a kind of 11 board members, research members trying to give a clue to the government to understand it and see how they can convert those local currency, those Kiswahili in Bitcoins. And we should not hesitate actually to embrace those kind of technologies. We should, because if we let it, the informal sector will take it, and the harm and the challenges will be bigger than now.
What should we do to make sure that all African countries access technology, use it in education, and what are the experiences we're seeing in Kenya?
I think part of the challenges have already been mentioned by our colleague from Botswana, in terms of, first of all, having connectivity of electricity, and then extending that to internet, and then making sure that the internet is cheap, then getting to the regulatory aspect where we get the internet hopefully to be free. For the countries that are already ready, of course, they must also be amenable to sharing their experiences with the other countries. One of the approaches could be doing that at the regional level. I think part of the countries, if you talk about, for instance, South Africa, we have SADC, Kenya, we have ECOWAS, or rather we have EAC, Ghana has ECOWAS, and we have countries like Egypt, Algeria, and so on. So the idea has to be that this is an initiative that can be cultivated at the regional level before we even bring it to the AU level in terms of those countries sharing their experiences. Now, on those experiences, when we talk about digital literacy, one of the things that we are trying to do, for instance, in Kenya, and we have to be very open about this, as we seek to roll out the CBC, we are experiencing a lot of pushback. And that is because, obviously, some of the resistance that we are getting is from factions that are stuck in the old ways, and they don't feel that we can do this until we are 100% ready. But we can always come up with a piecemeal approach where we ask ourselves what can be rolled out and what do we need to develop as we roll out the rest of the processes. And that is really part of what is happening. Finally, on universities, we also have an initiative where we are challenging them to respond to demand. Again, we are getting a lot of pushback on that, but it is a kind of initiative that has to happen if they are to offer training that is relevant to the needs and demands of the market. Thank you.
Should we be just helpless that social media is ahead there, or there are some interventions we can make?
Well, helplessness is definitely not an option. But I think, again, that conversation about fake news raises the issue of the fact that, we talk about technology, but technology is just a tool. There are many dimensions to technology that need to be considered. So there's ethics. There's an ethical dimension to it, which is where fake news comes in, where, all sorts of actors want to sort of, use technology for good or for bad. There's issues of race and gender. I mean, we know there's evidence that, for example, facial recognition technologies misidentify black people more than they do non-black people. So there are all of these issues that I think that we must always keep in mind when we discuss technology. So the ethical aspect of it is where that's where the fake news comes in. And so if you look at it as an ethical issue, then it means that you've got to ask certain questions. The first question, actually, one fundamental question is, what constitutes fake news? Who decides what fake news is? Is it the government that decides? If government decides what fake news is, we know that there's a tendency that it might be a certain kind of definition. If it's civil society that decides, it's a certain kind of. So how does one define or decide what is fake news? And for me, what I see as the way forward is that all parties, government, civil society, technology companies, citizens, must come together. On the issue of fake news, everybody must come together. You cannot have a solution without multi-stakeholder engagement, where you decide what is fake news, where you decide even on. So, for example, for me, I'm not an advocate of governments sort of deciding what is fake news and clamping down on media organizations. I would rather a system where news organizations themselves come together and have some kind of almost self-regulating, self-sanctioning mechanism. Of course, but again, governments have to be involved because there are legal implications. Judges have to be involved. What are we doing in terms of educating judges about handling libel cases in the age of the internet? How many judges can effectively decide, for example, what it means, what fake news or what libel or whatever is in this age? And so for me, I think what I would just say is we need to get all the stakeholders together. That's the first step, to discuss what is fake news, what is hate speech, what is all of these things in the age of the internet, and what are we going to do about these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Faladi, in 1 minute, can you say final words for these men?
Thank you very much. I think I just wanted to just say very quickly in wrapping up that infrastructural development cannot be overemphasized. It has to be the first foundation. It's super important. When I travel to Europe, I never need to buy a SIM card because I know I'll have Wi-Fi anywhere I am, and I can order an Uber or taxi or anything like that. I only buy a SIM card when I come to an African country because I know otherwise I'll be in trouble. I'll be stranded if I don't have a local SIM card. The second thing is that I've been hearing them talking a lot about strategies, frameworks, and I think that is very important. But sometimes I cringe because I know there's a huge gap between strategy and implementation in Africa. So as much as we do that, let us push more for implementation, because otherwise we'll have those great digitization strategies and frameworks, but they will just accumulate dust and wait for the next election so that politicians will tell us they are going to digitize. The other thing is that time is very important. Technology is evolving, so let us try to catch up and not have take this at a snail's pace. The same thing with a demographic dividend. It only becomes a dividend when we are able to invest in the demographic transition when it's timely. If we miss that opportunity, this is going to turn into a demographic disaster. The last thing, let us make sure that a technology investment does not worsen the already existing inequalities, because we have countries like my country, Botswana, Namibia, they have really acute inequalities, income inequalities, and we know that even earlier on, Philip talked about that technology has that disadvantage of widening the inequality gap. So as we do that, let's ask ourselves, how do we mitigate the reducing inequalities and lead by example? Let us ask the AU, how digitized is the AU? Do they have an AU conference app to reduce the carbon footprint? What's happening to all of these printouts that we have here that we won't use again? Thank you.
I have to confess that I do consultants for the World Bank, and they have put aside $25 billion under a project called Africa Moonshot. You don't just get the money like we used to get. You must make steps towards digitalization of records and other things so that you benefit from those resources. education is going to change seriously, that those who understand what it means would utilize most of those resources. If you don't understand, this is where you create your social capital by talking to those countries that have gone ahead and also helping the countries that are still remaining behind. Now, from Philip and all these men here and lady here, you can ask a directed question to any one of them or a general question that we can see how it can be responded to.
Challenge of Africa is policy implementation, as she has just said, and resource misappropriation. My two questions are, number one, from the distinguished panel, are our states doing enough to prepare the young people, especially from the rural areas, for the fourth industrial revolution? And what is the role of the private sector, or is it squarely on the shoulders of the government to prepare the young people and the states for their fourth industrial revolution? Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mukunya Mugo. My question is, data is a new oil in the fourth industrial revolution. So my ask is, what is the role of government in ensuring that our data as a citizen is kept private and secure, considering we upload a lot of personal information on Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, etc., Uber, just to name a few?
My name is Wambo Wagedeiga. I work for an organization called Mau Governing Council of Kenya. I've got a question for the speaker. One, on inculcating a culture of cultural moral values, where the ways of the internet or the digital technology have played a pivotal role in the decay. At what level would we have that interface of changing the morals or creating a mindset, even through the civil, even through the public service?
The question is understood. At what level?
Yeah,
let us respond to the three questions. I think the one on moral, I would ask Tolu here on moral issues.
So I think for me it's not, and I'll push back to young people. It's not about what the government is doing. It's what are you doing with the internet that you have? So that it's not just about Facebook and all these things. Secondly, I think in terms of data, PS Ndemo was, when he was PS, he got Kenya into the Open Data Initiative, which Kenya was one of the first countries in 2012. We have a dearth of countries right now, especially, I think there are 13 African countries who are part of this movement with open data portals, connecting that to the Open Government Initiative. So it's not only about the data or technology, it's also about the governance framework of how that data will be used. And so countries like Kenya, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Senegal are part of this global initiative around open government. And so we talk about how do we able to harness the data revolution for development. It's not data for data's sake.
Okay,
Philip, how do you harness that?
Philip, you can add Cedric on that.
Yeah, I was actually talking about asking you a question about whether it's intentionally trying to elude those principles or applying them into the political scene. Because if you're talking about open data, there is principle of open data. And yet, talking about, it's a threat, talking about privacy and all those kind of things. But if, for instance, you are a civil servant, you should understand that your salary and your public assets should be public and should be disclosed, because it's the way that the citizen should be allowed to see if you're performing well or if you're accountable. So yeah, you can talk about privacy maybe at an individual level, and that's why we're talking about regulation and cross-interdisciplinary approaches. Because if you're talking about Uber or Google or Facebook, those companies are not Kenyan-based company or African-based company. They are mostly Western-based companies, and that's why our government should be involved into those world regulations to be sure that data of the citizens are kept secure.
You know, everywhere you go on the continent, you will hear there's a lamentation about how we're losing our values, you know, whatever those might be. Young people, how do we get them to, you know, get involved? How do we get them to, you know, in the whole values building and character building and all that? I think that one of the biggest lessons that we can learn, or we've seen from technology, is that it's important to see how people actually use it. It's important to see what people are actually doing, and to tailor whatever we are doing along those lines, instead of insisting that we want people to come. You want to meet people where they are. So, for example, I think of a show like Big Brother Nigeria, which is about to start at the end of the month, actually, which is hugely popular in Nigeria. And of course, if you ask any government official, most people don't, they're not exactly happy about that. But for me, I think the future is governments asking themselves, how do we use those kind of tools, to engage young people on issues of, civics, on issues of governance and all that. So, for example, at the moment, there's no content in any Big Brother that it has to do with governance or anything. Okay. But there's a way you can do that, you can incorporate it. Okay. And so for me, I think that openness of mind is what I think is the way forward.
Okay, and Machogu on readiness, which is important.
Yeah, thank you very much. Two very good points. If we wait for readiness as a benchmark, we will never do anything. So ideally, the better approach is to ask ourselves, where are we ready? We kick that off, and then where we are not ready, we roll out what needs to be rolled out. So that if the constraint is that we don't have infrastructure, we don't have electricity, we don't have internet, then we can be rolling that out in the places that are not ready, as we roll out, say, programs such as digital literacy in the places that are ready. And then on the role of private sector, PPPs.
Thank you very much indeed. The President of the Republic of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, Honorable Ministers of Public Service, Your Excellencies, delegates, we have come to a successful conclusion of our business. It was a very packed 3 days. I cannot help. There has always been a full attendance throughout the 3 days that we have been here. Thank you very much indeed. We are particularly indebted to the Commissioner for Political Affairs and her staff for organizing this August event. The host country, the Cabinet Secretary, Professor Margaret Kobia, thank you very much. The Principal Secretary, our Chairman, and your staff. We will forever be grateful and indebted to you. We have covered a wide range of thematic areas, from building effective public services, empowering the youth, harnessing the youth dividend through the use of technology, inclusive and integration, and the advent of the fourth industrial revolution. In simple terms, the role of the new technology in development. I can only wish and hope that we have enjoyed the sessions and all of us have had at least something to take home to implement. I must congratulate those who are going to receive awards and certificates. Indeed, I suppose they are worthy winners. And I congratulate all of those who have participated in the exhibitions. We are very proud of you. We appreciate and applaud your efforts. In due course, we will be informed and advised of our next host country, and it will be sooner rather than later. Once again, Chairman, I thank you and wish you well in your endeavors. And I thank everybody in this hall for participating so effectively in our deliberations. Bon voyage, everybody. Asante sana. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my privilege and pleasure to invite the Minister for Public Service, Youth and Gender Affairs, Kenya, to present her comments and thereafter further invite the chief guest to address us. Madam Waziri.
Thank you very much, PS, who has also been our Director of Programs, our Chief Guest, Dr. Joseph Kenywa, who is Head of Public Service Kenya, Honorable Henry Sikatre, the Minister of Public Service, Kingdom of Lesotho, and also the Chair of Specialized Technical Committee number 8, colleague ministers present, ministers and the heads of delegation from the 36 countries represented here, Chair, Public Service Commission, distinguished delegates, facilitators, presenters, ladies and gentlemen. Our chief guest, let me start by thanking you for finding time to join us, and more so for you facilitating His Excellency the President to join us in the opening ceremony. Thank you. Our chief guest, we have had the 3 days engagement. They have been intense, very deliberate, and you can see they have taken into consideration the communique from the youth, because we believe, just as in African Union and also in Kenya, that youth forming the biggest population segment in any of the African countries, they need to be involved, they need to be engaged, to use their energy, their resilience in supporting socio-economic development of the African countries. Chief guest, allow me to thank all the participants whom have been very patient and sitting through all the sessions and at the same time contributing, and that's why we feel the outcome document, which has got the recommendation, as very clear, actionable activities that we are going to undertake in our countries, and then in the next African Public Service Day celebrations, we will be able to report on them. We have had presenters, facilitators engaging with us, and I want to thank them very much, and especially also the county government, which has facilitated us within the city, and their engagement has been a very invaluable input. Let me also thank the Public Service Commission, which has been with our partners, with us, right from the preparation and up to the conclusion. Of course, I thank the African Union, our chief guest, and the member states for honoring Kenya to host this particular 2019 African Public Service Day, where we come together to celebrate what is working in the public service and that we should keep, and what requires improvement, that we should look at innovative ways of improving public service for the purpose of getting us where the Africa we want, as spelled out in 2063 agenda, is more or less fits very well with other African countries' national development agenda. In Kenya, we also have Vision 2030, and we particularly have the midterm of 5 years where we are looking at the Agenda 4. So that improvement of public service, chief guest, means where public service is effective and efficient, even the socioeconomic growth improves so that we can have more jobs for the youth. Our chief guest, as I conclude, we are committed as Kenya to participate and take our respective roles in African Union, and especially through the ministers of public service. And I want to thank especially the ministers, 6 of them, and putting myself. This has been the highest where ministers of public service have turned up and then gotten engaged up to the closing day. I want to tell you, let's give them a clap. Normally, ministers have a tendency of just appearing at the opening and then thereafter they leave. These ones have stayed on because they would feel what they are going to take away from here will make a real difference, break new ground to improving public service. Our chief guest also, we have innovation awards because we also want to recognize those public servants who have gone out of their way to come up with innovative ways, and later, after your speech, you will be recognizing at least the top 3 who have really done well, and they need that recognition so that they feel motivated, and not only that they are going to keep this innovation, they are going to roll it in their countries, and other African countries can borrow. My real task was really to invite you, our chief guest, so that you can give your comments, but we are, and I think, 2 hands of public service here. And what we learned, especially when we had the topic of political and managerial interface in the public service, it came out very clear. The office of the head of public service is the center that holds. And that's why we are very happy you could find the time to be with us here, because every public service, the office of the head of public service really is the one which drives public service. So with those very few remarks, our chief guest, let me have the honor of introducing you. Dr. Joseph Kenywa is not just a head of public service, but he has grown with the civil service to the extent that he was permanent secretary, National Treasury for many years. And not only that, even before he was permanent secretary in agriculture, so we could not have had a better chief guest who understands the heartbeat of the public service. So karibu sana, our chief guest.
Thank you very much, Professor Kombia. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Her Excellency Mrs. Mineta Samate, quite a difficult Commissioner of Political Affairs, African Union, Professor Kombia, our Minister for Public Service, Honorable Minister from Lesotho, who I understand is the chair, other honorable ministers and heads of delegations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to join you for this closing ceremony. Let me begin by thanking the African Commission and the Minister of Public Service, Youth and Gender Affairs of the Republic of Kenya for successfully hosting this year's African Service Day celebrations. We have gained invaluable knowledge from the presenters, moderators, panelists, and experts. I thank them all. As for the visiting ministers, heads of delegations, and every single delegate, you have honored us by your presence and your contributions. Asanteni sana. Ladies and gentlemen, the discussions held here have been fruitful and informative. I believe we all take home valuable lessons. Let me share my reflections in the hope that they will reinforce what has been learned. Ladies and gentlemen, public service across our continent faces 2 huge challenges. 1, fading trust by our citizens, and 2, reluctance to adapt to emerging technology. Firstly, in the last couple of decades, we have seen how radically lives have been changed by the advent of mobile telephony, by technology, and by many other recent groundbreaking innovations. Unfortunately, not every technological change is for the better. Secondly, across our continent, citizens' trust in governments and in private and civil society institutions alike has either fallen or is shaken. Why? As a general rule, the larger the institution, the less responsive. But more importantly is some of the challenges we have been facing in some of our countries, corruption, inefficiency, ineptitude, have weakened the trust, which is indispensable for effective public service. Ladies and gentlemen, the theme of this year's celebrations provides some answers on how we can overcome the challenges we face. We certainly must attend to youth empowerment, to migration, to good governance, and to ICT and innovation. In addition to these, we have to get a handle on emerging technology and regain the trust of our people. On technology, we who are charged with the advancement of the public interest have our work already cut out for us. We have to sift good technology from bad, and we have to minimize disruption and risk to our people. We must also strengthen public-private partnerships if we have to have any hope of coming to terms with disruptive technology. Governments, in virtue of their role as data depositories, have special reason to work with private sector disruptors, both to protect the public interest from the unscrupulous and to advance it by making the most private sector innovation. To be clear, public-private alliances mitigate ICT risks and maximize the gains we can get from that technology. To gain public trust will, however, take a lot more effort from us. You will forgive me for drawing on my experience of the Kenyan public service. It is a vast reservoir of knowledge, expertise, and institutional memory, easily the best educated, largest group of people in the country. I believe this is also the case in most other member countries. Why then is the public service so often distrusted? Simple. People don't trust on competence alone. Rather, we trust those we think are competent and, more importantly, mean well. And there is no more efficient way of showing that we mean well than by inclusion. To gain that trust, we must also efficiently use public resources. Public servants should never forget that theirs is more than a job. It is a call to serve with humility, honor, and dignity. Thank you very much. Overseeing public affairs and defending the cause of our citizens is an exalted business. To win back the trust of those we serve, we must therefore embrace a new humility and rededicate ourselves to efficiency, equity, and fairness in all our dealings. Most importantly, I urge all of us to remember that public service is more than doing a job efficiently and honestly. It must be complete dedication to the people and the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, I close with 3 goals we should embrace and work towards. Africa must rebuild strong public institutions. Africa must allow the talent, the energy, and ingenuity of its youth to flourish. And finally, Africa must make the most of the opportunities ICT has brought us. Who is the public servant who will help the continent achieve these aims? It is the public servant who understands there is no greater honor than public service, and who spends his career not in selfish ambition or conceit, but in humble service to humanity. If each one of us here resolves to be that public servant, our continent will flourish and cement its ties, praise of pride in the community of nations. With those few remarks, it is now my singular honor and privilege to declare the 7th edition of Africa Public Service Day celebrations officially closed. Asante sana, thank you, and bon voyage.
This is very good. I have what to do.
Tungerudi nyuma tena.
Keep it up.
Thank you so much.
Make sure you the next one.
Okay, thank you.
Crunch Africa. A round of applause for Crunch Africa. Thank you, chief guest. Thank you so much. Head of Public Service, Nigeria, the best booth. Welcome. A round of applause for Nigeria.
Wow.
A round of applause. Thank you. And finally, sir, the special recognition, the Judges Award, is a virtual chemistry lab by Crunch Africa. Crunch Africa. Crunch Africa again. A round of applause for Crunch Africa. Thank you very much, sir. Allow me to invite Cabinet Secretary, Public Service, Youth and Gender to present. Best with the government.
Chief guest, we are very happy that you are able to join us. Remember, you also facilitated a visit from a team of Commonwealth. And one thing that we learned in this hall is if we could only improve performance management in government and take it to the next level, then public services in Africa would really get us where Africa, the Africa we want. So with that, we thought you are not going to, we are not going to live here without a book. And this book is Performance Management in Government from the Commonwealth.
A round of applause for our chief guest receiving a book from the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you, and God bless you so much.
As we said yesterday, the youth really are the majority in this country. So when we talk public service, we're talking about providing service to our young people. But more importantly, we also want to know how we can work together, all right, in the delivery of that service.
Okay. Thank you very much for your patience. As a sign of gratitude for you coming to Kenya, we have a gift for every delegation. Kenya, we are known for the best coffee and tea in the world. So we would like you to take some tea with you as you go back home. Algeria, kindly come to the front.